today we're talking about time in fantasy and science fiction worlds. And this came up as part of a conversation with an author friend of mine this week, and we were discussing how time works in worlds that are not like our own. But first of all, let me do a quick overview of how time works in our world because it's a lot more interesting than you think. So we go by the Gregorian calendar, which was first introduced in 1582. The Gregorian calendar is basically a solar calendar, and the solar year, so the time it takes for the sun to return to the exact same position in the sky that it started from, is 365 days and a quarter day, which is why we have a extra day, February 29th, in our leap years, because that kind of makes up for the fact, like, there's no way you can add a quarter day in there, so you lump those days in there, and that's how you get your extra day. So that's the solar calendar. Then there's the lunar calendar, and the lunar calendar is about 11 days shorter than the solar calendar, and it goes specifically by the phases of the moon, how long it takes to get from full moon to full moon, or new moon to new moon. And if you follow a 12-month lunar calendar throughout the year, it means that there's no relationship between the months and the season. So if you follow September, for example, in the 12-month lunar calendar, it means that September could happen in the fall, it could happen in the spring, sometimes it could be summer, sometimes it could be winter. If, however, you're following a lunisolar calendar, that calendar, through a series of probably very complicated mathematics that I don't understand, they basically try to make the lunar calendar and the solar calendar match up with some degree of efficiency so that you can follow both the phases of the moon and the circle of the sun and the positioning of the sun so that the months and the seasons match up to some extent. So that's just a really quick overview of years. Now let's take a look at weeks. We follow a 7-day week. Well, not every society in the world, in the history of the world, has followed a 7-day week. I believe it was ancient Rome that followed an 8-day week for a time before Christianity kind of changed everything. And there have been calendars from ancient Egypt and ancient China that follow a 10-day week, as well as there was a brief 12-year period, I believe, after the French Revolution where they tried to follow a 10-day week as well, but that didn't last very long, obviously, and they ended up switching back to the 7-day week, which is what the majority of the world uses. So, that's just a brief overview of how time works in our world. Now let's consider how time might work in other worlds. So one of my favorite stories ever is a hard science fiction called A Deepness in the Sky by Vernor Vinge. I hope I'm saying his name right. There's a star that wakes every 250 years and bursts into life, and it causes life on the nearby planet to flourish. And for a period of time until the star goes back into its dormant phase again, and all the life that is on the surface of the planet then moves underground for the duration of the star's dormancy. And it's such a fascinating use of time and how different astrological bodies influence the rhythm of life. And of course, then you see in other sci-fi, maybe a planet has a shorter year or a longer year based on the length of its orbit. Maybe there's a couple different moons. Well, whose phases do you go by? Moon number 1 or moon number 2? Or do you try to find an intercalculation between the two of them and mark time that way? So it can get really, really interesting. And one of the reasons why this time aspect of world building came to my mind was because I have been writing the Firewing Chronicles for years. Not quite ready to be published, so hang on to your horses. But one of the societies that I am building in this world is a society that lives completely underground. How the heck do you tell time when it's underground? The best I came up with so far, and it may get tweaked, is that there's annual flooding from the surface world above that comes down into the waterways of the underground world. And so it's not a very precise measurement of time, but it's an approximate measurement of time that, okay, every year about this time there's flooding, so we'll mark it from flood to flood and call that a year. So that's my very approximate version of time, but I may tweak it a little bit. And if you have ideas, I would love to hear them. Ideas either about the flooding or about just how you might tell time in an underground world where there are no astrological bodies to tell time by. I would love to know your thoughts. Anyway, that's all I have for you. Come back next week for another book-related talk and more coffee with Yaasha.